In this video, I want to talk about a question that I get a lot from students of mine, which is that I'm at a certain level, I'm preparing for a certain type of interview. What is different about what I need to be doing than what everyone else is doing? Right? It's a big difference between preparing for a, you know, fresh new grad role, preparing for someone who is in the middle of their career, preparing for someone who is looking for a senior engineering role, or even preparing for a management role or beyond. And the question is, what do I have to prepare differently when preparing for coding interviews? Now, I want you to think about this in terms of a basketball player, right? Imagine the difference between LeBron James and a high school or college basketball player. If you put them in on the court and you had them play one on one against each other, LeBron James would obviously, or we could assume, would win by quite a margin, right? But the reason that LeBron James would win that game, would win that one on one, is not because he knows something that the other people don't, right? It's not because he has a different strategy. It's not because he's using different tactics. It's not because he's doing anything fundamentally different. The key is that he is better at executing on the same things. And when you're preparing for interviews and when you're considering what level do I need to be at, whether that's, again, level in your career, or even if we're talking about a company like Google versus a company that maybe no one's ever heard of that also does coding interviews, the question that you have to be asking is not what are the different things that I need to learn in this situation, but how do I execute better on those same things? Right. And I want to give you an example of this. And I want you to give you a way to think about this a little bit more clearly because this is the broad concept, but how do you actually apply this to your interview prep? Right. And so if you think about what most people do when they go into interviews, most people use what I call the hoping and praying technique. And the hoping and praying technique is basically that you go into the interview, you look at the problem, and you hope and pray that you can come up with a solution. And while that can work, right, there are plenty of times where you might, if you've, grinded enough leak code problems, if you've studied enough different algorithms, you can go into an interview, you can see a problem, and you can, intuit the solution. But the problem is that there are also going to be lots of times where you go into the interview, you see a problem, you say, I have no idea how to solve this problem. And then there's this question of, well, what do I do now? How do I plan for that situation? What am I doing to make sure that in that situation, I'm actually able to succeed? And this is where having a process for approaching problems, having a consistent process, having a consistent framework for solving every problem makes such a difference. Because when you have a specific framework, you can look at how do I get better at each step of the framework, right? So the framework that we teach our students, we start by really understanding the problem super well. Then we come up with a first draft or a brute force solution. Then we optimize that solution. We code up the solution. We test the solution. Each of those steps is something that we can individually optimize, right? Because if you want to get really good at solving problems, let's consider an example. Let's say that you look at a problem and you're like, I don't even know how to come up with a brute force solution to this problem. Then in that case, the issue in your ability to solve that problem, the issue that we have to address first, has nothing to do with your ability to come up with an optimal solution, right? We're not even at that point yet. So a lot of times people look at a problem and they're like, I can't come up with an optimal solution. But it's like, okay, well, you can't even come up with a basic solution. You can't even come up with a brute force solution. And if you can't come up with a brute force solution, then the rest of it doesn't matter. And the beauty of having a framework and the beauty of following a framework and being consistent in how you apply that framework in an interview, right? Because it's one thing to know a framework, and it's a totally different thing to actually use the framework. It's a totally different thing to actually execute on the framework in your interview. It's a totally different thing to go into the interview in that high stress environment where there's an interviewer breathing down your neck and actually be able to execute effectively on that strategy. If you have that, then it gives you that consistency. It gives you that consistency, and it also allows you to address all these individual pieces, right? If you think about LeBron James, to go back to our basketball analogy, what is LeBron James really good at? Now, I'm not a basketball player. I don't have a background playing basketball, so I'm sure someone who is a big basketball fan would have a more specific answer to this, but here would be my guess. My guess is he's really good at shooting the ball, right? He's probably way better than you or I at making baskets consistently and making baskets while someone's trying to defend him or while someone's trying to screw him up. He's probably way better at dribbling the ball, way better at passing the ball, way better at all these basic things. And that means that even if he didn't have some fantastic strategy. Even if he doesn't have a strategy that's better than anyone else, he has the brain power to be thinking about other things. He has the brain power to think about the meta strategy because he doesn't have to think about like, oh, well, I'm dribbling the ball. I need to make sure that I don't like mess it up. I need to think about how I'm, lining up my feet to take the shot. He doesn't have to do that. It's so natural that he doesn't have to do that. And he can focus on what is the meta strategy? What is the way that a couple minutes down the road, at the end of this play, how am I going to get the ball into the basket? And in the same way in your interviews, if you're constantly thinking about, well, what was that data structure again? How does a tree work? How do I do breadth first search? How do I, remove an item from a linked list? If you're thinking about that, then you can't think about the strategy. You can't think about these higher level things. If you're going into the interview and you're worrying about whether or not you're going to be able to come up with a solution, then you can't think about what is an optimal solution, right? If you feel confident that you can go into the interview, that you will always be able to come up with a first draft solution, that's when you can start worrying about optimizing. That's when you can start worrying about all these other things. But this is why, if you've watched any of our videos recently, if you've watched the lives that I've been doing on this channel, you'll see there is a ladder in this process. The first layer that you have to cover first is those core data structures and algorithms. If you don't know the core data structures and algorithms, then the strategy does not matter. If you don't know how to dribble the ball, I can give you all the strategy in the world, but you're not going to be able to move the ball down the court and actually execute on the strategy. If you're not really good at those fundamentals, and then once you have those fundamentals, really good at each individual piece of the strategy. What most people do is they start at the top. They start like, this is the goal, right? The goal is to solve the problem. And now I'm just going to work my way down and try and fill in the gaps, right? I'm going to start with the outcome being to solve the problem. If I can't solve the problem, I'm going to take one step backwards and look at the solution to the problem. If you look at the solution to the problem, there's still all this gap. And the problem is that when you go into the interview, you're not starting from the solution, you're starting from the bottom. Right? When you go into the interview, you're starting from the bottom where you don't know what the solution is. You don't know anything about how to solve the problem. But every time you practice, every time you study for interviews, you start at the top. You start with that end goal. And so you learn how to go that direction. You learn how to start with an answer and then work backwards to understand how that answer works and ultimately get back to the solution by figuring out what were the data structures that I needed to know to solve this particular problem. What were the tools, the algorithms, the processes that I needed to understand for this particular problem, but you never connect the dots in the other way. If you want a programming analogy for this, think about if we were doing, let's say that we wanted to find the shortest path in a graph, for example, and we were using breadth first search, right? We have to, what we essentially do is we find the path going forward, and then we have to actually keep track of what those steps are going backwards, right? Every time you add a node to your queue, you have to track what the previous node was so that you can backtrack. We're essentially saying, like, the way that most people do this is I have the solution, and the solution points to the data structures, and the data structures point to the algorithms, and I have this, linked list, or this one directional chain going backwards to the solution. But now you're given really what's happening is it's like you're given a linked list. You're given in the interview, the way that you're constructing it, you're given that final node in the linked list, and they're asking you, well, reconstruct the whole linked list. And you can't do that. And so this is turning into a little bit of a rant, but I think this is so important, is whenever you go into an interview, when you are preparing for your interview, the difference between those who are good at interviewing and those who are great at interviewing and those who are incredible at interviewing and those who get the job and those who don't is not that one person knows more than the other person. It's not having different knowledge. It's being able to better execute. It's being able to better execute, because the better you can execute on those low-level things, the more it opens up mental space for you to focus on those higher-level things. The more brain power you have to dedicate to Well, how do I implement a node class for my linked list? The more brain power you have to dedicate to that, the less brain power you have to think that next step ahead or that next 2 or 3 or 4 steps ahead. And so with that, if you want to get really good at interviewing, if you want to be really, really strong, one, I would definitely recommend checking out our free training. Our free training will take you through our entire process for how we take people from the position where, okay, I know how to do my job as a software engineer. I know how to do that, but I can't get through these actual interviews. It'll show you what our process looks like and how we can work together. And even if you don't do that, think about how can I make sure that my fundamentals are so strong that I have the strongest fundamentals and that gives me the strongest foundation for everything else. That gives me the most mental space to do that next level thing, and that 2 level things up. That's the thing that's going to move you from down here to up here in interviewing. That's the thing that's going to take you from being a college basketball player to being LeBron James. And so with that, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing everyone on Thursday for our live stream.